Oh, actually I can't. I'm doing it. All right, so to officially start, welcome to the UCCHRE webinar on teaching human rights advocacy. Today we have Mila Rosenthal, who is an instructor at Columbia University and also Director of Communications at UNDP. And we also have Bill Simmons, who is a Professor of Gender and Women's Studies, as well as the Director of the Online Human Rights Practice Graduate Program at the University of Arizona. Thank you both very much for joining us today. Mila is going to begin, and Mila, maybe you could first begin by just giving a little bit more about your background, and then we can transition into your experience in teaching human rights advocacy. Thank you both.
Thank you, Christina. Hey, it's great to meet all of you. Thanks for convening on this, because I'm well, I'll talk about the course that I'm teaching, but I would also really love feedback and ideas. So I'm as much looking forward to hearing Bill and hearing from the rest of you as I am to sharing the insights that I have. So I come to human rights teaching as a practitioner. I was at Amnesty International for a long time and started off with working on labor rights and economic justice issues, and was part of Amnesty's move towards working more broadly on economic and social rights. And that's really been the focus of all of my advocacy for a couple of decades. And so from economic and social rights, I worked on a series of research projects on health as a human right, and moved into working in international development organizations on rights-based approaches to development and anti-poverty work and public health. And now at the United Nations Development Program, I'm in the chief advocacy role of advocating on the entire sustainable development agenda, including the rights and justice underpinning for it, and why that's also connected. So so the first thing I would say is that, you know, one of the interesting experiences for me this semester is this is the first time that I've taught in the university setting a class that is really purely an advocacy class, so an advocacy skills, methods, and academic class. So have taught as an adjunct human rights professor at Columbia for a few years now in and originally with an economic and social rights class. It was that I designed in the early days, I think, of the human rights master's program as one of the core classes for the master's program. It was really to teach the tenets of economic and social rights and how they're different than civil and political rights, the history of why they were, you know, how they split from civil and political rights. And so I always started with that, a bit of the history, and then a lot of the class I focused on students understanding the concepts like minimum core obligation and non-discrimination, progressive realization, and all of the standards in the different committees. So I wanted to make sure everybody understood kind of the policy framing, and then some of the issues around implementation, justiciability, and so forth. And naturally, in teaching that class, I brought in examples from my own advocacy work on maternal mortality as a human rights abuse, the work on the push in the negotiating the Sustainable Development Goals for the Goal 16 rights framework, the labor rights work I'd done. So I was using my examples, you know, in storytelling, but also assigning a fair number of case studies. And part of the reason that I did that, I mean, first of all, that's my experience, but also because one of the things that I found was that although generally students who were coming newer to human rights didn't have some of the kind of skepticism about economic and social rights that, you know, some of my older generation of human rights practitioners did from growing up in civil and political rights. So it's not that they came with that history, but they did tend to have a lot of skepticism about whether things worked. And I think, I'm guessing that everybody has this now from having taught non-economic social rights, human rights classes. I know that this is part of an important discussion in teaching, is the kind of healthy, I think of it, there's a healthy critique that students bring, you know, want to talk about the role of rights and the efficacy of rights. But I kept feeling in the class that it was sort of sliding over into a lot of beyond skepticism to cynicism. It was sort of like, well, you know, this is really, but everybody's, you know, there's so much poverty, how can you say that's a human rights issue? This just, you know, ESCR is obviously not working. You know, kind of was a little bit of the tone of the discussion. And so I found myself more and more really highlighting those case studies, those campaigns, those examples where you could show victories and impact and change for communities. So moving beyond some of the policy framing issues and implementation issues to really kind of drawing out throughout the course of the campaign, seeing where things ended up changing for people. And that was really how this course was born. So it was because I was finding that was the part of the course that was resonating the most with students, and it was the part where I felt like it made it most concrete and most real. So that was the history of this course, which very thanks really to Christina's support and suggestion that I reshaped into a class that is advocacy and campaigning on social and economic rights. And I would say that's, so there are really 2 points I would take from it. First of all, I just developed the syllabus. I took a little bit from my previous syllabus, but pretty much everything I'm teaching this semester is new. I'm teaching a lot of things from advocacy workshops and things about communications and framing messages and so forth. So I have a lot of new sources, but I also have a lot of new assignments. And since I'm just kind of a third of the way into teaching it, I'll talk a little bit about what I'm seeing so far, but I really feel like I'm in the middle of kind of learning the lessons of what's working and what's not. But I have 2 observations from it so far. One is that I think it's an advantage that I'm teaching economic and social rights as sort of the topic of advocacy. And so I was thinking about what it'd be like if I were framing something like in a very general general human rights advocacy, although I know that there are those classes, and I looked at syllabi for a couple of them, and I think those are great too. But I'm feeling that it's giving it that grounding in giving them, in some ways that I feel like students sometimes get options paralysis. You have just too many choices. So I feel like starting at least with a framework that narrows it down a little bit, that gives them a sort of discipline about thinking about an issue that they want to work on and develop an advocacy plan around, that is concrete, that they have a smaller subset to choose from, and they have a certain range of tools that go with economic and social rights more naturally. And so I feel like that's actually been an advantage, because I'm trying to cover 2 things sort of in the same semester, right? Both some of that understanding of economic and social rights and sort of how they work, how they measure the standard setting, and then the advocacy tools and tactics and skills. So anyway, that's one of my observations, is that at least so far I think that's an advantage, that it's a little focused. And then my second point is the point about teaching the skills and tactics, which is interesting because I've done that at work for so many years with so many of my team members, with policy colleagues, in various ways, both through formal workshops and through meetings and sessions, and kind of bringing teams together on developing campaigns and so forth. And I'm finding it really interesting to try to translate that into enough of an academic setting that master students feel like they're having an intellectual experience and engagement, an academic experience, but that they're working on things that are just extremely practical, and that much of which you really could learn at the tactics and skills level, learn in a training, in a workshop, in a professional development sense. So that's interesting. Today I'm receiving the first assignment. I set up the assignments to be short things over the course of the semester, in part so they would break it down for them, and in part so that I could kind of check in with them really regularly over the course of the semester. I told them at the very beginning that this was a new class, and that I was asking them to give me a lot of feedback, to do constant check-ins and iterations, and that I was, as I developed the assignments, that I was going to give them a lot of leeway to kind of see how they took it, and then I was going to talk to them about it, and so that I can think about what's working, what's not. So the bulk of the assignments that I've given over the course of the semester, this first one today is a 2-page policy brief, so it's really short, and it's to get them to think about how do you frame recommendations on. So they pick an issue, an economic or social rights issue, that they're going to work on, they're going to advocate on for the entire semester, so that they're going to do different kinds of advocacy around that same issue. So starting with the recommendations and policy brief, so they have to think about who has influence over this issue, where would the change come from, how would you persuade them, move them along, push them, campaign against them, what are your, how would you communicate that issue directly to them or to whoever can have influence. And then from that, that will give me a way to talk them through all of those kind of questions. And then I'm doing a series of skills building, like doing a media interview, framing a pitch to journalists, framing a campaign pitch for grassroots organizing, if that's applicable, sort of series of different tools depending on what the arc of their issue would be, what kind of campaigns or what kind of tools it would be susceptible to it. And then at the end, a full advocacy strategy and a way to have impact assessment, which is what we're looking at a lot over the last 2 or 3 weeks of the class, to keep reminding them to go back to that question of how do you know what works, and how do you know what are the milestones along the way where you're on the way to something working or something really not working. So yeah, so those are kind of my 2 main findings for at least for very new class. With my initial sense from it is that giving it the concreteness of a framing around a certain set of rights, and trying lots and lots of different small assignments, kind of little bites of the apple, for them to try out the different kind of approaches to advocacy in a very concrete way, is how I'm approaching it.
Great, thank you very much. And again, we'll have questions at the end, but Bill, I turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you. And thank you, Mila. I really appreciate your comments. I'm going to share a PowerPoint. I hope, can everyone see this?
Yes.
Oh, okay. And so when Christina asked me to talk about teaching human rights advocacy, I said, of course, because whatever Christina asks, I'll say yes. But then I realized quickly that I didn't know what human rights advocacy was. It's a term that I've heard, I've written about, but I'm not really sure what it is. And so I asked a few of my colleagues in our human rights practice program here at the U of A, and they kind of looked at me with blank faces. They didn't know either. So I kind of decided I'll just talk about how I teach and how our program runs. And I think this is human rights advocacy, but you can tell me whether it is or isn't. I run a fully online MA and grad certificate in human rights practice. It's a 30-credit program. Previously, I was the founding director of a master's program at ASU in social justice and human rights. So we just come down an hour and a half down the highway here. Our program is 2 years old, and it is fully online. Our program is all practice-based. So I think all of it is advocacy, but I'm not sure. We don't have courses in human rights theory. We don't have courses in human rights history, and we don't have courses in human rights institutions. The whole program is about how do we advance human rights for marginalized populations around the globe. How do we work with community? How do we encourage empowerment? How do we meet them where they are? How do we be humble when we talk to human rights or to marginalized groups? We have really innovative courses that cover almost any topic. So anytime an issue or an advance in human rights occurs, we can usually fit it into one of our pre-existing courses and offer a course on that within 2 weeks or 3 weeks. We call these pop-up courses. So for our pedagogy, somehow we've created an intimacy in the online environment where almost all the students will say they feel much closer to the students and faculty in our program than they do in in-person programs. And how that is, I have some conjectures, but I'm not really sure. But a lot of it is because we're working together. We are being humble and vulnerable and generous with each other. And we are all contributing knowledge. As you can see, we emphasize decolonial, feminist, indigenous perspectives. And then 2 main innovations, of kind of structural innovations, is one, we have video conference guest lectures in every class. And two, we do what I call online problem-based learning beyond borders. So I'll go through those two and then kind of give you a couple examples, and then we'll talk about whether this is actually teaching human rights advocacy or not. But the video conference guest lectures, this is a big thing for us. We have, in a 7-week class, we'll have 5 or 6 video conference guest lectures. And the faculty have to do this. We've put aside money for this. We pay each of our guest lectures $400. So it's, maybe not a lot for, New York, that's probably 2 pieces of pizza, but, for somebody in Tanzania, $400 can run their NGO for a month, so, and with 5 or 6 in each class, we've had over 150 video conference guest lectures. They've all been recorded. We have an archive of them that at some point we will make available to everyone. Our guests have come from 40 countries. We've had some amazing people from grassroots indigenous activists in the far corners of the globe to UN special rapporteurs, the president of the Human Rights Council, major players bringing cases to major courts. And so each course, the faculty member pretty much thinks, who are the 5 or 6 coolest people I can bring in? Who have I always wanted to meet? One faculty member said, well, I want to write an anthology. Who are 5 or 6 authors I'd like to have as part of that anthology? And then you get to know the people, and the faculty are as excited to have this conversation as the students are. So you can see a few examples of this. I'll just talk about a couple of these. Course on decolonization. The person who taught that for us has worked in most of these places and was able to get the leading indigenous water defenders from 6 different countries, including the people who've just won the cases to have a river be given human rights, or for an ecosystem to have human rights. Course on African freedom struggle featured leading activists from Cameroon, Senegal, Burkina Faso, South Africa, the DRC, and others. And then when we did a course on Me Too movements in India and the US, we had activists, attorneys, survivors from both countries. And so on top of having the video conference guest speakers, then every class, or almost every class, buys into the idea of doing project-based learning or problem-based learning beyond borders. And this is working with community members on real-world problems that come up from the community. So we are constantly, when we are developing curriculum, if an NGO comes to us or we meet somebody from an NGO and they say, oh, I have this issue that I really want to advance, we say, oh, would you like a student faculty team to work with you? And then we'll make a course around that problem. And when we do that, clearly if it's a real world problem, I don't have answers to it. None of the faculty members know exactly how to address the problem. And so we work together to address it. And we try to have the community members work with us as much as possible, knowing, they might have other better things to do as well. So we're co-generating knowledge. We're trying to advance human rights in almost every course. And this decenters human rights knowledge. It's a very decolonial kind of perspective, or feminist perspective, in that the professor's not the expert in the room. Oftentimes the professor's the one who knows the least, or knows, is close to knowing the least. This is a very nonlinear, messy, unpredictable process, just like doing human rights work it always is. It's based upon relationships and trust, vulnerability, humor, all these kinds of things. Now, I don't know if those are skills. I don't know if they are, if that's knowledge or if it's more of a craft. But it is, it's about human relations. And so human rights work is so much about being able to be a good person, or as, I forget who, I think it was Lynette Chua says, is this somebody I could have tea with? And I think that's a real nice way of looking at it. So just quickly, a few examples. We taught a strategic litigation course last spring. There were 5 student groups. They worked with 5 NGOs, one in Kyrgyzstan, one in Moscow, one in Ekaterinburg, Russia, one in India, and one in Alaska. And literally worked on projects, even though we're fully online. You know, they had to work through the language difficulties and everything, and literally worked on projects the NGOs came up with. And so a legal clinic in Kyrgyzstan was getting a lot of domestic violence cases, and they knew how to do the legal piece, they didn't know how to do the other pieces when working with domestic violence victims. And so our students created a white paper based upon best practices in the region and the situation in Bishkek. And that white paper kind of laid out steps that they could take to develop a more holistic domestic violence center. And actually that is being implemented as we speak. And it was just a group project from a 7-week course. I co-taught a course on the Rohingya crisis in Bangladesh. We had 5 guest speakers from Bangladesh, including 2 people who work daily in the camps. My co-instructor had just come back from the camps, and he had taken a lot of photos, gathered children's pictures, and did video interviews, and we used those throughout the course. And from that, the students had to do something real world with all this, all these materials. And 2 student groups actually organized gallery shows for the photos. One was in St. Louis and one was in Phoenix. Because it's online, our students are all over the place. So they were able to do that. Another group of students made a children's book out of the photos, and I'm actually trying to get the children's book published. It turned out extremely well. 2 of the students loved it so much and thought about working with the children that they convinced me and the co-instructor to help them with a grant to actually go to Bangladesh and work with the children. And we did get a National Geographic Society grant to work with the Rohingya children. And so me and one of the students just returned a couple weeks ago from Bangladesh, and then we'll be going back in May. So like our classes are very organic. I'm never sure what's going to come out of them. I never am sure, you know, it's very unpredictable, to say the least. A current example, I'm currently teaching a course called Community-Based Participatory Action Research for Human Rights. And when our faculty are assigned a course, they start thinking of what real-world problem can we address. And I work with the Lost Boys Center for Leadership Development in Phoenix, and I'm sure you know the Lost Boys are from South Sudan and underwent incredible hardships from about 1980 to 2000. And the Lost Boys ended up in a refugee camp in Ethiopia, and then they had to go back into South Sudan, and then they ended up in a refugee camp in Kenya. Well, we have, as a Lost Boys Center, we actually have an archive of 17,000 interviews that were done in the refugee camps. And no one really has access to this but us. And it is there's nothing been done with it. And so I said, well, let's have this be the project for our students. Now, to encourage them, to show them how important this project is, on the right is 2 pictures from about 10 years ago of Lost Boys who just learned about the archive and found their records. And so this is basically the only thing they have from their childhood. And so our class is, one of the projects is to connect Lost Boys and girls with their archive record. And then I've divided the class into 5 groups, or they divided themselves into 5 groups. One is just doing the data cleaning, which is immense. Another group is looking at intergenerational trauma, and we'll actually ask the Lost Boys about the situation with their children. One is interested in the lost girls. One group is working on a museum exhibit. One is working on grant writing to fund the development of this project. Just to give you an idea of the unpredictability of this, according to my syllabus this week, we were supposed to do X, and I realized, no, we couldn't do X. We needed to do more brainstorming as a class. And so, we just had to say, hey, this is what we're going to do this week, because this is what the project requires. So a couple of slides to end this. First, is this teaching human rights advocacy? I'm not sure this is human rights. I'm not sure this is teaching, and I'm not sure it's advocacy. So other than that, I am teaching human rights advocacy. We're teaching by doing and to do with. So I'm more of a model of a human rights advocate. I'm not teaching them, human rights advocates do X. I'm the one saying, hey, I don't know. This is where, let's go look at this source. Maybe this will help us. I don't know much about remembrance projects. You want to do that? Let's talk to my friend Caitlin who does that. And so if we, need skills, like if we need quantitative data, I can help with that. But other skills I don't have. So I'm doing what human rights advocates do, which is to go and, to do the project. Some insights real quick. Something I've believed for many, many years is that students can do so much more than faculty expect them or students expect them to do. Students can really make a difference in the world. When students are doing real world problems, their passion increases greatly. The one challenge, the academic calendar doesn't coincide with the real world calendar. No court case has ever taken 7.5 weeks. So what we do is projects continue over semesters and over different courses. Oftentimes students then do an independent study or a capstone on something. Projects and video conference guest speakers come from almost any conversation. So I'm always, I'll have a meeting with somebody and next thing I know, I'm saying, oh, let's create a course on that. I never really thought of creating a course on that, but wow, that would be cool. I'm afraid we're going to be inundated with projects. We have a lot of NGOs who've talked with us and want us to help them. So we're designing a database of projects for students. And ultimately, we want that to be a database for other human rights professors to use in their classes as well. And we're also launching an online speakers bureau for human rights video conferences. And finally, we're building our human rights program. All of these are fully online. All will have the same pedagogy and curricular model. We're going to have, starting in fall, a new certificate in gender-based violence, one on documentary media and human rights, one on human rights and technology. And then in spring, we hope to launch a bachelor's degree using the same curriculum and same pedagogy. And then we have a committee that's pursuing the idea of having a PhD in human rights practice. So I think this was teaching human rights advocacy, but I'll let you tell me different.
Great, thank you very much. Both of those presentations, I have many questions.